G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. You are halfway through the week, well at least for the Australian time zone. If you're starting your halfway point, well, you should be in the land down under. But legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. But again, I am trying to bring these shorter, but also the war has really slowed down. But today we're going to be talking a lot about diplomacy, ceasefires, negotiations. Look at what the Ukrainians have said, look at what the Russians have said, as well as the Americans, and then read into this about what do we think is the likely outcome of this. And we also need to talk about then the outlawing of any negotiations with Putin and how this will then affect things, and will Ukraine then change that law if Putin shows up in Turkey. And we'll have a bit of a conclusion to all of that as well. I know I'm sitting here and I tell you, the current diplomatic situation is growing the tumour in my head faster than I think anything else could. My God. But we'll start on the maps because we do have some updates today, and of course a lot of talk about an upcoming offensive. And we did speak about that yesterday through a contact of mine who said, look, it just feels like in bits that he is seeing in history that we may start seeing very large movements. And at the end of the day, Europe, Ukraine, America, whoever, they can ignore the battlefield as much as they want. That's great. You can ignore it. But we know throughout history that the reality of the battlefield is going to be the major factor in any real negotiations, not political theatre. So let's look at the maps. Now, before I actually show you where we are on the maps, let's start with then, is a major offensive coming? And this is being reported by the Financial Times that Ukrainian intelligence assumes that Russia is likely preparing for a large-scale offensive. Now, what I believe here is we will see an increase in tempo of operations, but attritional war does not have decisive attacks. That is not how this works. It's grind down till there's a degradation, then you start with then deeper warfare. And that's what we'll see, is just that slowly going down. And I talk a lot about attritional warfare, how it's like bankruptcy, little by little, then all at once. And if you're the way inclined, if you know anything about black holes, I'd call it like the event horizon, that you as an observer, you will not observe. So when someone crosses the event horizon, you'll see them go and then they'll just fade and fade and fade. But if you are the one crossing that, you'll then have the feeling of nothing, spaghettification, and then you are all your future from timeline to light to everything is all past that then event horizon, and actually picking that point where that was crossed is very, very difficult. Now, it's easy to do this in history because we know we can look back, but remember that hindsight is the foresight of assholes. And they're saying that this is evidenced by redeployment of Russian troops to key hotspots on the battlefield. All of this happening against the backdrop of an offer by Russian President Putin to hold talks with Ukraine. Again, a lot of this is still political theatre. We'll talk about why Putin has then made that offer. And it's not going to be a singular hotspot. It's just going to be multiple different areas and pushing like it is. And I think we may see an increase, but we're not going to see what some may expect of just massive arrows on maps. Maybe we will. And what I have said is if we do see that, what then is Europe's play? Now, if an increase in offensive actions, if we see this should not come as a surprise at all. Although I believe it's going to come as a surprise to many who just read the Western main media or all of basically the major YouTubers who from 2022 have reported that Russia has been strategically defeated and now ignore the battlefield and maps and instead harp on this idea of this irrecoverable attritional losses, but only ever pointing at one side of that also. So it may come as a shock. And I think that many people are going to get some major shocks when this war ends about kilometre squares, casualties and realities that war drives politics. It's politics by other means. Now, Russia has been consistently recruiting, reportedly, 30,000 troops per month. And that is not only sustaining manpower for a longer war of attrition, but it's over the loss rate. And even if we take those loss rates that we are getting reported, which we know are, incredibly inflated, but with that, it's still growing. And what this does too is it means that then your forces can go through a more common training cycle. Now, the way that Soviet doctrine can work in an attritional war. A Soviet doctrine was set up like this. Now, I'm not saying the Russians follow complete Soviet doctrine, but it's a bit of a hybrid of this. Is during a long war, experience is gained where NATO forces will step in very professional, and then that experience will then impact the professionality due to then the attrition. It works somewhat in the opposite for the Russians. That's what we see. In many, many wars, we see better throughout, but massive losses in the beginning. And there's improvement over time, but also an easier replenishment of forces. Now, warmer weather is just a big part of this. I don't care about drones and armoured vehicles and aeroplanes. Weather still affects the battlefield as much as anything. It's like with any technology. I don't care what gets developed. Large bodies of water are still the greatest deterrent for any sort of war. But we are seeing that it is warming up, it is drying out, and summer is traditionally the season of war in Eastern Europe. And we'll see a surge in fighting in these months. The kilometre squares maps, these graphs, they tell us about this, as well as operations. So the Operation Bagration in, of course, World War II, when Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in June, and when Ukraine went into Kursk in August. Again, if you are on the offensive, you do this at the best possible time. I would say, I think there'd be a lot of regrets in the Kremlin about launching the war in February 2022 due to the terrain that the forces stepped into. Now, what I think Putin is doing here with offering negotiations in Turkey, all of this, remember, for some reason, the media is all reporting it that this was now Zelensky's idea. It was Putin that came up with this idea of having some level of talks in Turkey. We'll go over more of that in length. But what I think Putin is doing here is, with Trump in power, Russia, they are waiting to see if they can achieve their objectives diplomatically. Because, of course, doing that diplomatically is far, far less expensive. It's way cheaper to do it diplomatically. If Putin can get to those borderlines of what is requested through diplomatic means, that is far cheaper for him than doing it militarily, and doesn't come with, of course, all of the risks. He's also buying more time, hoping the US will scale back military support to Ukraine and the war will become easier then for his forces. Although for 3 years, everyone had arguments about who is time in favour of, which was a ridiculous argument. But we see then that is why I think there's a lot of diplomatic actions. But once these negotiations inevitably collapse, I do believe the war will resume at a faster pace. Russia is going through the Clausewitzian idea that war is a continuation of politics by other means. And there is this Western notion that war never achieves anything and that the cost of war always outweighs any gains. And that simply, historically, just isn't true. So I think that is, I guess, a run over of what it is that Putin's going, right, well, the cheaper option is to take these areas, my objectives, diplomatically, but if I have to continue militarily, if there's no movement on any of that, well, then we will do it militarily. And for those European leaders, Mr. Karen Karalis, saying that, Putin's then buying time, extending the war, that's exactly what strategically you would be doing in a case like this. Okay, so let's actually then look at the maps before maybe we will see major moves. Here's Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check is ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. I'm also going to be showing you some fortifications today. So I believe probably the most major move on the maps here is on the Pokrovsk eastern sector. Of course, we have seen Russia move from Baranivka, Tarasivka, all the way to Novolenivka, as well then enveloping this area of Suka, Balka, Romanivka too. And we see this movement on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk today. Now, this movement is a little bit further than this. I'm going to show you a geolocation of this. So this geolocation is right on the top of where this reservoir is, right about here. I've got that as close as I can. What we see in this geolocation is, or what the geolocation is then a flag going up here by then Russian forces, giving us confirmation in that area. So let's measure this. Remember, what we are seeing in the attritional warfare is this gain of, say, 3-ish kilometers day to day, and that move and move and move until we fall off a cliff. But given the geolocation, this is a minimum. I've gone from really the closest point here of, let's go the very closest, of about 4.2 kilometers. That is a major gain. What I always say with this is, yes, people love to show the map zoomed right back out, but go out on the road and walk 4 kilometers. And when we look at then the fortifications here, you can see that this is significant. Now, let's confirm this movement with the Syriac maps and show where other bits and pieces have moved. So Syriac maps from all the way from Nolenivkia all the way down to this then movement across that road. He's showing that a lot of this is getting filled in and out to then this eastern side towards Kalinove as well, and then deepening this sort of 2 pocket that we have at the moment. Then the next update here then confirms this movement up and through Malanivkia as well, confirming where that geolocation was more accurately than this map here, but also more movements just around this area, this Miroluabivkia, on then these reservoirs, their northern side as well, by this. And then there's another update. If you look at where this reservoir is here, just below this to the southern edge, that out from Horodkia, that Russian forces are moving in here as well, at least according to Surik. So then it's sort of encapsulating, enveloping that reservoir and then moving forward. Of course, building the flank of then the eastern side of Pokrovsk. And many are suggesting that the offense on Pokrovsk is getting ready to go. I don't believe that. I think the Russians, if you would ask me, will try and get a foothold further into Dnipro Oblast first. They'll definitely try and build this to a fatter eastern flank and envelop Pokrovsk more, because at this point in time, it would really be a front-on assault here. And what we know is, I don't care what YouTubers say, that is the way Russia like to take these areas. But what I've got here is I've then grabbed John Hellen's map, John Hellen on Twitter, and this is the Ukrainian fortifications in this area. So this is that Malanivkia, that area where the Russians cross that road. This is that major intersection right here. So when we come in, this is then major intersection. We talk about this movement out here and Pokrovsk, just to line you up. So this map, realistically, fairly close. But we also need to look at, well, if we overlay somewhat of the Syriac, this area in here is somewhat coming under control, as well as in here. Okay, let's go, it's halfway between there, that there are some major fortifications coming under control. Just by this today, if we look where these have come from so before this major intersection, so from before the major intersection, that a few then defensive lines have come under control, and that really there's only a couple before Pokrovsk down here, or further out to the north as well, to more than envelop that Toretsk front line, and using then that as the western flank and the eastern flank of Chasiv Yar. So it's very important to look at where the Russians are moving and where they're going to feel resistance, because like anything, the path of least resistance is always taken. So let's move our way just to the south west of here a little bit, and then we come to Rozhdev Bahatar. This is confirming that there is Russian break-in into Bahatar. We know that has been very likely the outcome here for some time, and we have a couple of Syriac maps here. So on the first one, we see just to the north of Constantinople, some ground being made, and as well to the south of Bahatar, to the south of Odrane as well, that this is Velika Novosilka, that this area up in here, almost to the east of Komar, so out in here, is coming under control, but also confirming then this movement of Novosilka, Novopil, Zeleny Pole as well, but showing that this is really filled in. So definitely confirming somewhat of this movement, and then the movement up here also. And the break-in into Bahatar, but showing it more of a leveled off front line, which, as I've said in this, Rozhdev, this is there we saw the island boys, and that's just not really how offensive actions in attritional non-maneuver warfare really work. And then we get this update here today, and what this is showing, during the last 48 hours, Russian army took control over 60% of Bahatar, so this area here, all the way to the south of it, and also breaking into Oleksivkia as well, so out of Andreevkia. So weighed out on that, but some larger movements there. But this is another area where I wanted to look, and if we zoom out and we get an idea of where Velika Novosilka is, where Rozhdev is, where we see the Russians pushing. So we bring up the fortifications. This is Velika Novosilka, right out on this movement here. That's where Mr. Helen has put in the Bahatar movement. And what we can see is they're trying to push down here, really where the defensive lines are the most thin. So trying to push through here and then launch that further envelopment of north and south of here. And again, warfare like water takes always the path of least resistance until you see it then moving on. And you need to look at as well where this line sits. This is the main defensive line from Velika Novosilka, where the Russians have, even by these maps, got close to or past. But also it's very thin beyond this, much beyond Velika Novosilka and where Bakhtar is, that a western push here rather than northern push is fairly thin. So it is important to look at those fortification maps as well to get an idea of where the Russians are pushing. And we'll show you a few others in a sec. So that is all of the deep state map updates we have. But let's go then up into Tournai, because this tells us a lot as well. So we see no real movements around here shown by this map today. We bring up then the Syriac maps, and it does paint a different picture. So what we are looking for is we're looking for Kolodiazi here as well. So just down, move this across. In this sector, that last 4 days, Russia took control of the first streets of Rikadab. So this is right up in this area, but also on the northwest of Kolodiazi. So moving northwest in here, so a few kilometers further from where the front line is shown here. But we do know there's definitely a lot of movement and attacks around this sector. Now, I believe this sector is two-pronged, and that's why Russia is trying to fatten this. There is the push towards Kolodiazi and the push towards Rikadab, because it's trying to envelop this area here. Remember, bodies of water are the hardest thing to cross at whatsoever in warfare. That they're trying to push out here to then have this whole sector in here have a withdrawal, but also trying to push down and create the northern flank of the Seversk front, because to break through into Seversk for the last 3 years has been almost impossible. So that's where we then look at the fortifications, and this is what then Big Serge was speaking about. So this is this push in here. This is Rikadab, this is Kolodiazi, sit just about here. That's where that waterway is. This push across in this sector, see how thin the defensive lines are according to John Helen, but also this try to push to Yampil from the Tournai front, which sits in here, to try and build from Seversk. To see how thick all the defensive works are in here, to try and come from the north to south down through this sector and envelop that and cut off the roads while on this, rather than trying to push directly through these areas. So you can see how you can maneuver around, very slow time, around those defensive lines. And let's move then further down into Toretsk. Now, this is where Ukraine has made some ground back today in Toretsk, not being shown on this map today, but situation Toretsk front. In the last 3 days, Ukraine army recaptured Kosminol suburb and rented again this complex. On the other hand, Russian army made small advances in the 12th district of Dashnay. So right in the centre here that Ukraine did push that back. That is confirmed through footage, but it's not showing different to then this map today. And then further pushes southwest of Dashnay as well. So still a lot of movement in here too, but a lot of attrition too. When you're launching offensive actions, you are accepting somewhat you're going to have higher attrition on that. Ukraine's primary goal right now should try and be to get the best ratio of attrition possible, regardless of then the kilometre squares. But of course, that all comes factors. Now, let's look at then Pokrovsk and where things are shifting in here. Of course, we're coming back down to this area, and we're looking where Uspanivka is and where this movement then towards Dnipro Oblast is happening. Southeast of Novomakhlivka, following withdrawal of the Ukrainian army from here. So the area we're talking about is right down in this sector, and this is where this shows dramatically different. See this dotted line through here near the S? This is this dotted line. This is in the border between these oblasts. That Syriac is suggesting that this whole sector where my cursor is here, has come under Russian control. And if that is true, that is going to definitely change our kilometre squares, because let's go from there to there, say 5 by, say, 4. So you're talking 20, 25 kilometre squares minimum in here. Again, weighed out on any of that. But there still is a lot of movements on this map. Again, very hard to get an idea. Now, we're going to look at the fortifications once more when we come up into Kupiansk. This is the sector I say. Keep an eye on this around Dolphinichny, because we did see Russia cross then the Oskil in here and be able to get and exploit a bridgehead on the western side. And that was any tell of the degradation of the Ukrainian forces, that was to me the biggest telltale sign of that. Not things moving, but it was able to cross a waterway like this. And this is where we come up into this sector. And we see Kupiansk and then Dovrichnia, you get an idea. But you can see where the then saturation of offensive works in then this pocket in here on the eastern side. And where the Russians are focusing their effort is not in here. It's on this flank, because if they can just outflank this and then push either down to the south on Kupiansk or continue to deepen that by pushing west, where it is very thin on defensive works, although there is some forested area, you can see how on strategy, not tactics, that can have huge effects on areas. Again, there's a lot of bloggers, analysts, whoever, who are saying that the Russians are too cowardly to push directly on offensive actions. You go, but that's not strategy. It's not cowardice. You play to your advantage, and if you have numerically the larger force and you can envelop things and push on multiple different sectors, that's what you do. If Ukraine's in that same boat, you do the exact same thing. That's military strategy. You don't do what looks the most brave. Okay, so again, we are seeing a number of envelopments take place, and it just takes you to zoom out to see this. Around Kudakov, around Toretsk, around Siversk, and of course around Kupiansk too, and where this could then move that front line fairly quickly. Now, let's talk about diplomacy. I know a lot of people find this boring, but it is very, very important. Now, what we suggested yesterday is Zelensky may go to this and say, well, unless it's Putin, I'm not going to speak to them, as a bit of political theatre as well. And this is what his advisor, Mikhail Podolyak, has spoken about, that Zelensky, he will not meet any other official. It will just be if Putin goes. And realistically, the one I'd expect to go is Mr. Sergei Lavrov, their Minister of Foreign Affairs. Will Putin attend? Well, that's still up in the air, but I think unlikely. But they will have to weigh up in the Kremlin what are the positives and the negative repercussions for then attending. And I think politically, Russia is trying to play this game of appearing to the global south and other nations, and especially the US, as being the party who is trying to base negotiation off battlefield reality to those leaders, and therefore seeming like the more reasonable party. And that's where he's trying to then move that informational warfare around. And he's doing that on terms that they know Ukraine and the coalition of the willing won't accept. So therefore, further pushing that then battlefield sort of how it looks reasonable, but also then creating massive frictions between NATO and, well, European NATO and the US, while dragging out the war for US support. But while seeming like he wants to have an end, but dragging this out and then further tarnishing how Ukraine looks in the US and others' eyes too. So I think there's a lot of political theatre happening here, but it does look like Putin won't be attending. Kaja Kallas, of course, from the EU has said, I believe Putin won't dare meet with Zelensky in Istanbul. Russia is playing games, trying to buy time. So what I'll say is, I don't think this is a dare or not sort of thing, but so you do admit now, Ms. Kallas, that you do admit that time is on Russia's side. So if they're trying to buy time and you're basically confirming that it is, why wouldn't they play into this? Wouldn't time be the greatest enemy for a sanctioned state? Okay, this is where a lot of this is starting to fall apart. Now, about the presidential decree from Zelensky banning any talks with Putin, we've done a little bit more digging into this. And Zelensky has said that this is Russia's narrative. So anything that ever is criticism, remember, is a FSB operation narrative, but it's a narrative that I can't negotiate with Putin. No one but me can negotiate on Ukraine's sovereignty, territory, and territorial integrity, of course, so only him. According to Ukraine's constitution, these are my rights and duties. I represent the state's interest. I issued a decree to prevent people like Novinsky and Medvedchuk from holding direct talks with Putin. That idea that I need to cancel something is purely Russia's narrative. I don't restrict myself. So it is no one else can speak, but I am then above that. But the way I've read into this and everything that doesn't seem to be this, and Podolyak as well somewhat confirms this too. This was in the Times today, that Podolyak said that Kyiv would make amendments to a law banning direct talks with Putin if the Russian leader decided to attend the negotiations in person. So they're saying that basically by this, the law does need to be shifted. And that's my reading of it as well. The law was introduced in 2022 after invading troops killed then and tortured civilians. This is what this says. But it wasn't just that. That wasn't the trigger for that either, actually. the trigger for then the law was in direct response to Russia's formal annexation of the 4 Ukrainian regions at the end of September 22, because then this was signed in October 4th, 2022 to ban any talks there. That was what it was directly then in response to. And it states, to state the impossibility of holding negotiations with the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. So saying it is impossible to do that, and that it was Putin specifically. But the law, what I'm reading, it does currently bar Zelensky from engaging in talks with Putin, although officials have indicated the decree could be amended if Putin agrees to attend. But this does give us one big shift here. It does mark a very large shift in Kyiv's diplomatic posture towards Russia, that they're willing then to really bend, to change laws, to go back on decrees, to then have talks with Putin. And I think that is significant when there's to be no bending at all to Russia, but you're going to have to, or they're saying that they will for this. Again, it's just this trickle in of certain shifts that are being made. Now, I guess in conclusion here, that Reuters report that it'll be Steve Witkoff, Keith Kellogg will attend. They'll go to Istanbul. But with all of this, I say Putin wants to negotiate and Zelensky wants a ceasefire, and both are not interested in each other's bloody actions here. So what I'm saying is I think this will then fall apart. And I think they know this deep down too. Zelensky has said that I must negotiate a ceasefire as only he can decide on it. So no one else, it must be Putin there. The Ukraine leader urged US to introduce its hardest hitting package of sanctions if Putin rejected the call to meet in Turkey. Putin is afraid of direct negotiations with me. My forbidden question in this, though, is what if Putin just says no? We know that every sanctions package has less and less effect, and even some behind-the-scenes leaders are saying that, yeah, the sanctions have really lost their impact or further on this. What happens then what is the goal here? What's the goal for the Coalition of the Willing for Ukraine? What is next if Putin just says no? Okay? That's the biggest one. The Kremlin declined on Tuesday to confirm whether Putin would attend the talks. The Russian side continues to prepare for the talks from Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, and he says that we're not going to comment anymore yet. Realistically, I think most likely it's going to be Lavrov, and he's very experienced to do this. But of course, what Zelensky wants is president to president. But what I was saying, typically in negotiations like this, from the Ukrainian minerals deal to talks with Russia earlier on in the war, all of this, typically in a negotiation, that the lead technical or diplomatic discussions, which is what this is done by foreign ministers and special envoys. Exactly why Keith Kellogg and Mr. Witkoff are going. For then ceasefires, you'll have military representatives and some of the other leaders. And then for high-level summits and final agreements, names on paper, signatures on paper, that's when you have the heads of state. So I don't think there's any fear in attending here. I just think Putin sees this as what is being brought to the table here is just so far apart that it's not really going to get anywhere. But you need to remember too that it was then Putin who spoke about these talks. And I think it will give Ukraine a lot of propaganda ammunition if he doesn't attend those talks. But I hope that if he does attend those talks, Ukraine come with something ready rather than the proposition that is not, it's just not going to be accepted given the reality. And deep down, if you were to talk to Trump behind closed doors, he'd go, that is a piss take given the actual situation. That at the end of the day, the sword, what's it saying? The sword predates and transcends the pen. And Keith Kellogg has spoken about this, and this shows us where I think this idea of what I say is the diplomacy is growing the tumour in my head at an exponential rate this is just not going to work at this stage. You're going to have a very different looking battlefield before you can even think about this. Because again, you're trying to get Russia to stop the war. You're saying that Putin is the one with the control to stop the war. It also needs to either be done by, you need to show him the stick you've got big enough to stop, or the carrot as well. That's the reality. You may not like it. And Kellogg here, I'm like, mate.
Now the Ukrainians are willing to do a freeze in place, what I call a ceasefire in place, and then we'll for a period of time, they're willing to set up a demilitarized zone. What they basically said is, we'll back up 15 kilometers, you back up 15 kilometers to the Russians. So, it gets this 30-kilometer, 18...
So, but on a front line that has the momentum in the Russians' favour and likely is ready for more offensive action, that you'll be withdrawing both the same amount. Again, it's just not... I think for the Russian diplomats doing this, they're going to go... They can go back 30 Ks instead of... We're still moving in some areas of 4 kilometres a day to have that then DMZ.
...mile zone that you can actually observe. And you can actually say, okay, are there any intrusions? And then you've got what's called the coalition of the willing. That's the British.
So that then buffer zone that will be observed by the coalition of the willing.
The Germans, plus right now at least 12 other countries, are willing to put forces in an air.
So willing to put forces in the air cap in the west, so close the airspace.
West of the Dnieper River, not east. That's going to be a ceasefire force to actually slow this thing down. And
so again... But the way Putin will see this is he'll go, well, all you're trying to do is pause it, lose momentum, not lift any sanctions. So it only impacts me. It only impacts my end of the deal. There's no talk about sanctions, no talk about anything. And Ukraine then is de facto NATO by those forces moving in. That the way Putin will go, as I spoke about, I deleted the slide back there, but is that he is then... conducting politics by other means through then military actions. And like it or not, he is coming into this more powerful. And those sanctions, well, so far, the effects have been really limited. Like we're still seeing, we remember in the beginning of the war, we were getting told they won't be able to make dumb weapons, shells, whatever. And now we're seeing some very high-end weapons get developed. New missiles come into play. More planes rolling off than are being lost. So, again, where is this war leading to? It's probably 20... And again, hindsight's foresight of arseholes. I think many people would agree. End of 22 was the high waterline. Actually, the high waterline was this never starting, which I fully... Competent leaders could have avoided this at all, honestly. But now that it started, and it did, end of 22, negotiations in Turkey. In Turkey in 22, which now Boris Johnson is blaming then like the Biden administration for. I'm like, fuck off. But is it going to get better from here? And that's what has to be summed up is, right, using realist terms, is from here on going to deteriorate and worse at whatever rate, even slowly, or is now the best time? Because, as I said, if there is large offensives and the Russia's, 1,000 square kilometres a month, 2,000, however that may go, what do you think it's going to be like in the future when you try and come to negotiation again? I don't know. I'm glad I'm not in that seat because it's a very, very impossible tasking. But it's also a tasking that I feel like no one's really coming seriously to the table with any ideas. Like Mr. Kellogg's idea, it's like Russia... They will continue the war if there's a threat of NATO, if there's a threat of Ukraine joining NATO. So they will continue if it's de facto also. So, again, I don't know how this is going to look, but I think it's going to be messy, and I think we've got a lot of war left. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.